corresponda, ¿verdad?
Sí, cabal.
Sí.
Gracias.
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 I'm in Marcala, a small town in western Honduras. It's February 2023, and I'm in a car that pulls up outside the offices of one of the most successful organic cooperatives in the region, RAOS, la Cooperativa Regional Mixta de Agricultores Orgánicos de la Sierra.
It's like the general discourse.
I step out of the car, and it's a beautiful sunny day.
Buenos días.
I walk inside RAOS's offices. I pass a couple of coffee farmers who are waiting to get paid for their recent consignment of coffee cherries.
Bien.
I spot a few sacks of organic fertilizer sitting in the corner. I see stacks of manuals for how to farm coffee organically.
Hola.
And I make my way into the main office, where I meet the president of RAOS.
Bueno, mi nombre es Rufino Domínguez.
This is the same Don Rufino from the last episode. He runs one of the best organic farms in the area, and he's also the president of the cooperative. Today, the RAOS cooperative has 250 members, together growing almost 1,000 hectares of coffee organically. Sustainable Harvest, the sponsor of this episode and a leading importer for organic fair trade coffees, they tell me that RAOS has a reputation for being very professionally run and is one of the big reasons why Marcala and the surrounding region is one of the top growing areas for organic coffee in Honduras and much of Central America. But 30 years ago, it was a very different story.
Sí, bueno, sí, como le digo que había una discriminación en la naturaleza.
Don Rufino tells me what Marcala was like back in those days.
Sí, mire, antes.
And while he's telling me all this, I indulge in a bit of daydreaming. I pictured myself standing on a coffee farm on one of those mountain slopes that encircle the town of Marcala.
Si había un río aquí, de aquí empezamos.
And as I look down on the Marcala River, snaking its way on the bridges and in between the rectangular buildings of terracotta roofs, this river, which should be crystal clear blue, right now, it's black.
A la que se vaya al río. Las aguas mieles, sí, sí.
As I look to my left and right, I see coffee pickers going up and down the slopes, picking off cherries, because it's harvest time. But farmers back then, they would remove the red juicy flesh from around the coffee beans themselves, and then dump this red juicy flesh into the local rivers.
Las aguas se contaminaban, morían peces, morían.
This fruit would contaminate the river, and you would see dead fish being carried downstream.
Que hubo mucha contaminación, tanto con los químicos que eran tan fuertes.
A dead fish bobs past one of Marcala's health clinics.
Alguien le interesaba el billete, pero no le interesaba la vida humana.
And outside the door of the health clinic is a line of very sick-looking coffee farmers waiting.
A uno le había veces, yo vendía mis servicios de ir a trabajar en finca. Y me decía, mira, vos vas a usar esta bomba, vas a usar este producto.
Don Rufino shares a story with me when, he was working as a laborer on someone else's coffee farm. And he was spraying all these agrochemicals on the plants, which is common practice. Everybody back in the 90s was using agrochemicals.
Yo me pusieron a fumigar una finca para una mentada fumagina que le.
But for Don Rufino, spraying these chemicals day after day, he tells me he got really, really sick. And actually, at one point, thought he was going to die.
Yo una vez casi me muero por eso.
I imagine my gaze wandering from the clinic to some other nearby buildings, and I see a shop front. But it's boarded up, closed. And parked outside is an old dusty pickup, and there's a for sale sign attached. This is the consequence of the big collapse in coffee prices in the early 90s. At that moment in time, whether you collected your coffee cherries or not, as a farmer, frankly, it didn't matter. You're going to lose money no matter what you did. And I could imagine if I was Don Rufino back then, looking around, seeing the river contaminated, people are getting sick and prices so low, I would think to myself, screw this. Screw coffee. I'm getting out of this. I'm doing something else. But Don Rufino and a handful of other coffee farmers who are scattered across these mountains, they see an opportunity to earn more money for the coffee, to avoid touching agrochemicals and getting sick, to breathe life back into the fish and change the color of the Marcala River from black back to blue. And they think the solution is to go organic.
Sí, fue bastante como decimos, contra la corriente, porque la gente desconocía eso.
In the last episode, I showed you what Don Rufino's organic farm looks like. His farm is the model that hundreds of other farmers in this region try to copy. And I ended the last episode thinking to myself, this is an amazing way to grow coffee. It's kind to the environment, the birds love it, Don Rufino's really happy. The soil, it's alive with microorganisms. And because so many in this region have gone organic, the river is now clean, people aren't getting sick from agrochemicals, Marcala, as far as I can tell, is a thriving coffee town. But the thing is, in most of the rest of Honduras, in most of the rest of Central America, in most of the world, organic coffee is not how things are done. It's still a niche. Less than 10% of the world's coffee is grown organically. And it's a niche because going organic as a coffee farmer, it's really difficult. The fact of the matter is, it's easier to farm coffee conventionally with agrochemicals. So in this episode, I'm going to show you the story of the RAOS cooperative and how they overcame hurdle after hurdle after hurdle. And why, today, after having made this story, I now find myself choosing organic coffee whenever I can. And I'm very happy to pay a little more for it. I'm James Harper, and this is The Science of Coffee, a spin-off series from my documentary podcast Filter Stories, and a journey into coffee's hidden microscopic secrets. So, why are there so few organic coffee farms? There are many benefits to going organic, but many hurdles, problems, especially if you're a small-scale farmer. And the majority of the world's farmers are small in scale. You know, they farm maybe an acre, couple of acres. So looking at the story of the RAOS cooperative here in Honduras, what can their journey teach us about the challenges of going organic?
Entonces así empezó y el orgánico ya empezó allí por el 87.
So back in the late 80s, Don Rufino is experimenting a bit trying to grow coffee organically.
Cuestión orgánico. Habíamos como 3, 5 que nosotros los metimos y ahí empezamos.
And over time, he connects with other farmers in the area who all want to go organic. But the first problem, they didn't know how to farm organically, how to do it in a way where the trees actually produce a lot of cherries.
Porque la gente desconocía eso y como nosotros sabíamos andar con los...
But here's the thing, going organic is much more complicated and difficult to figure out compared to conventional coffee farming with agrochemicals. In a conventional farm, you follow a farming rulebook that doesn't really change that much between regions. Don Rufino tells me that when agrochemicals came onto the scene in the 60s and 70s, they had very clear instructions.
Empezaron a decirle a la gente, pruebe este saco. Entonces la gente lo llevaba.
You apply this much fertilizer at these times. You apply this much fungicide at these other times. Here are the chemicals. Now go off and do it over and over again. Now, of course, there are countless books out there on farming organically. And today you could watch thousands of hours of YouTube videos learning how to do organic farming. But the issue with organic farming is that what works on one person's farm may not work on your farm. A few years ago, I made a story about a pioneering coffee farm in Ecuador called Firefly. Mari Cooper, the guy who ran the farm, he started the farm about 15 years ago. It wasn't like the early 90s when Don Rufino was getting into organic coffee. Mari in Ecuador had the internet. He could hop on Skype for free and talk to farmers anywhere in the world. And he did all these things. But his trees barely produced any coffee cherries. Because in organic agriculture, what works on someone else's farm won't necessarily work on your farm. let's look at Don Rufino's situation. This is back in the early 90s in quite a remote part of Honduras. He doesn't speak English. Even if he wanted a book on growing coffee organically, where's he going to go? Don Rufino tells me one of the big ways they cracked this "how do we grow coffee organically" puzzle was with a bit of outside help.
Y vino una compañera que se llamaba Andrea Hutter. Ella era alemana.
They got connected with a German woman.
Well, I'm Andrea Fütterer. I'm working in GEPA, the fair trade company, and there I'm the head of the policy department.
But back in the 90s, Andrea was living in Central America.
I started my story with fair trade a lot of years back when I worked as an advisor for the German Development Service.
And before she moved to Marcala in Honduras, she had spent a lot of time next door in neighboring Nicaragua, working with organic coffee cooperatives.
Organic coffee was already established a lot of years in Nicaragua.
So Andrea and this small group of pioneering Honduran organic coffee farmers, they get connected and decide, let's learn what we can from what they're doing down in Nicaragua. So they all hop in the back of some Jeeps and drive south.
So we had some days there visiting the farms.
They filled their notebooks with all the organic know-how they could find, came back, and then took stock of all the information they had. For one, they had all this knowledge from Nicaragua, but nobody could say which of these Nicaraguan organic farming techniques would work in Honduras.
Of course, there was a lot of discussion because Nicaragua is a very different region. The climate is not that hilly as Marcala.
They also had, what they had learned up until this point, experimenting with organic coffee on their own farms. And finally, they had this intergenerational knowledge about the land that had actually been in their community for centuries.
Their fathers and their grandfathers, and there is so much knowledge accumulated in the people, so it was more to let it free again.
And then they faced the choice. We don't know whether this is going to work until we try it. And this is a big risk. For many smallholder coffee farmers, coffee farms are an important part of their livelihood, sometimes their only livelihood. Andrea tells me, understandably, people were nervous.
Some people seem to be a bit hesitating.
And so this is why, in my opinion, one of the first reasons people don't go organic is because it's a risk, especially if you're one of the first people to do it in a community. What if it doesn't go right? What if you have the same experience Mari Cooper had, in that farm in Ecuador I mentioned? It's so much easier just sticking with the agrochemicals. You know what you're going to get. It's reliable. But this story begins because in this group, there were some very brave farmers.
Including Rufino, who said, okay, let's go for it. We will try.
And this leads me now to the second reason why a lot of farmers choose not to go organic. Yields. And to tell me more about that, back at the RAOS offices, I met their general manager, Roberto.
Mi nombre es Roberto René González, soy hijo de productor, también soy productor de café y afiliado a RAOS.
Roberto is the son of one of those early farmers back in the 90s who decided with Andrea Futterer and Don Rufino to go organic. And it was nothing short of a disaster.
Fue un cambio drástico.
The yield on his father's farm collapsed. Before they switched to organic, while they were still using agrochemicals, it's common to get about 25 sacks of parchment for every half hectare or so.
Nosotros teníamos una producción de 25 quintales por manzana en ese momento.
But at that first year in the mid-90s when they switched to organic, the harvest collapses from 25 sacks of parchment to 8.
Orgánica bajamos de 25 a 8 quintales.
The plants, they look terrible, sad.
Entonces las plantas empezaron a ponerse tristes.
Roberta tells me the reason for this collapse in yields is because the coffee trees, the soil, had adapted to the agrochemicals.
El suelo estaba acostumbrado a recibir fertilizantes químicos, todos los productos químicos.
Coffee farmers switching to organic They ditch the blue pellets of artificial fertilizer and oftentimes use organic compost instead. But for a plant to access these nutrients, they need biology in and around their root systems. Things like fungal hyphae, like we mentioned in the last episode. But these things take time to develop.
A tener de 8 quintales por manzana.
But thankfully, they did slowly develop. Roberto sees the yields on his father's farm get better and better. The yields collapsed to 8 bags, but then the next year went up to 12,
Pues 12,
then 14,
14, y eso fue un proceso.
and upwards. And then, depending on the farm, maybe by the 5th year, that's when your yields get close to where they used to be.
La inversión que se podía hacer en una finca no era tan rentable.
Now, let's just take a step back. This is an enormous blow. This is the second big reason why so many farmers would not want to switch to organic. And indeed, in Marcala, in the coffee farming community, when they saw Roberto's father's yield collapse to 1/3, they told him, "You're crazy."
Momento de que la gente decía, no, esos tipos tan locos, ¿qué están haciendo con eso?
And Andrea Futterer told me how demoralizing it was for that small group of pioneering organic farmers.
So this is, of course, a very heavy blow if you see this decrease, and you have to have the confidence that it really will then with the time establish again.
And look, like it was back in the 90s, even today, any farmer who wants to transition to organic is going to have to confront this collapse and slow rebuild of their farm. But when I was at Sustainable Harvest Let's Talk coffee gathering in Honduras, I spoke with someone who claimed to have a solution.
I'm Lalo Perez, and we assist any producer who's interested in the transition from conventional chemical-based agriculture over to biological agriculture.
And he shared with me a couple of biological tricks, hacks he had used to help a Guatemalan farmer transition from conventional farming to a system he calls integrated biological management.
So it's fairly simple. We do 3 things. The first thing we do is we apply very dense and diverse biological inoculants to reset the soil biology. The second thing we do is we apply foliar micronutrients. And the third thing we do is we apply a biostimulant.
And Lalo claims when the farmers stopped using agrochemicals, the plants didn't look sad like they did for Roberto's father.
Then the plant is suddenly healthy.
And they managed to avoid that sharp collapse in yields.
Was able to replace fertilizer and fungicide within 6 months.
Now, Lalo told me he wants everyone to know about these techniques. So, if you're a farmer and you want to transition away from the agrochemicals, get in touch with Lalo. I've got a link in the show notes. I really do hope this works and we find other techniques for farmers to avoid that trough of despair. But as it stands, that is the second big reason why farmers wouldn't want to transition to organic. So now I want to take you to the third hurdle farmers have to overcome if they want to go organic. And that is, they have to find a way to get paid more for their coffee.
Ya trabajar en la agricultura orgánica necesita más compromiso, más tiempo.
I had many conversations with organic farmers in the area, and they all told me that, generally speaking, going organic, it takes a lot more time and know-how.
Un trabajador se lo tira en 20, 30 minutos por mucho barres, y el orgánico no, pues se les puede ir quizás el día o medio día para tirar.
But also, generally, yields are a little bit lower than what you would get on a conventional farm using agrochemicals. And to make up for that, you gotta find higher prices, which very quickly leads you to the whole discussion around certifications. To take an example, in the fair trade system, the minimum fair trade price for organic farmers is 22% higher than conventional coffee farms using agrochemicals. And getting certified, it's a whole complicated long process. Today, there are many hoops to jump through, and back in the 90s, for this small group of coffee farmers, it was a nightmare for them too. Fortunately, they had Andrea Futterer to help them.
So it was a long process in that time, still with a fax machine. So all the days we were sending huge faxes from Germany to Honduras, And we always making a lot of questions, and they with a lot of patience answering every question. Okay, the container must be like that, and you have to look for this, and the paperwork is like that, and you need that.
Getting a certification, it's a hurdle for a farm of any size. And just because your coffee is certified doesn't always mean you're going to get higher prices. It's a vast, complicated topic. I don't want to get too far into it here. So that's the third hurdle why many farmers would choose not to go organic. Farmers need to earn higher prices to compensate them for the lower yields and more time and energy they're putting into the farm. And look, if I was a coffee farmer, growing coffee conventionally, agrochemicals, and my business was running fine, why would I go through all this extra hassle?
Nosotros comenzamos a vender los primeros cafés a Gepa de Alemania. Es un cliente.
So, in 1998, that small group of organic farmers, they finally managed to export 22 sacks of certified organic coffee to Germany. And you think at this point, look, they've made it. This group of farmers, they managed to grow organic coffee, they managed to get certified, and they managed to sell their coffee. Well, unfortunately, there is another hurdle. The fourth hurdle, in my opinion, which prevents farmers from going organic. And that is being a part of a successful organic cooperative. So let's say you're a small-scale farmer somewhere in Marcala. And let's say you're motivated like Don Rufino is. You don't want to use agrochemicals on your coffee farm. You like seeing your farm as a haven for nature. By yourself, outside of a cooperative, it's almost impossible for your farm to be commercially viable as an organic farm. You need to learn which organic techniques will actually work on your farm. You have to find a way to get higher prices. And it's very unlikely you can afford the many, many thousands of dollars it takes to certify a farm as organic by itself. The only viable solution for you is to join an organic coffee cooperative. The organic cooperative will teach you how to grow organic coffee. They will manage the certification process for you. The cooperative gets certified together as a collective, and you're brought into that. So it's much, much cheaper per farmer. And they will do the hard work of finding buyers who hopefully pay higher prices for your organic coffee. That's the promise. So your decision as a small-scale farmer who wants to go organic, it really depends on the organic cooperative and how well it's being run. Is it open to new members? Can they support you in this transition? Are they good at getting high prices for you? But this is the problem. It's really hard. This is how Jorge Cuevas, the Chief Coffee Officer at Sustainable Harvest, put it.
The job of the smallholder coffee cooperative manager is probably the most difficult job in all of coffee.
And Roberto from the RAOS Cooperative, he admits, 20 odd years ago, in the early 2000s, those early days of the cooperative, they were not doing a stellar job.
Recuerdo que habían unos eventos de Hablemos de Café, eran abiertos para todos.
Roberto tells me a story. Back in 2005, they had been invited to Let's Talk Coffee, Sustainable Harvest's annual gathering of coffee farmers and other professionals from across the world. And Sustainable Harvest asked RAOS, hey, bring along some of your coffee. Let's see what it tastes like.
Y me dijeron, Roberto, tienes que llevar unas muestras de café. No, está bien, no hay problema, yo las llevo.
And RAOS brought along some coffee, but the coffee, it wasn't in green bean form, which is standard practice. It was in the stage before that, in parchment, where it has this thick yellow encasing around the coffee bean. RAOS at the time didn't have the ability to get rid of that parchment to get to the green beans. And it's the green beans which you roast, grind, and brew coffee, so you can taste what it's like.
Llevamos las muestras en pergamino seco.
The point is, the RAOS cooperative didn't know how to assess the quality of their own coffee. If a cooperative doesn't know what the quality of its own coffee is, they cannot negotiate better prices for their members. They're in the dark. And RAOS were not alone.
And half the time, growers had no idea why it was good or good enough or not good enough.
Sustainable Harvest was seeing this problem playing out in cooperatives across the region. Jorge tells me there was an enormous knowledge gap.
If you think early 2000s, no, the gaps were gigantic.
But since then, over the next 20 years, RAOS has managed to grow and expand the membership to hundreds of smallholder organic coffee farmers.
Y la relación que ha pasado con Sustainable ha sido más de transparencia, de enseñanza.
And Roberto tells me one of the key reasons is the learnings they've received from Sustainable Harvest.
Entonces lo que nos ha motivado a poder hacer las cosas bien.
Just like RAOS got help back in the 90s with Andrea Futterer, they also got help in the 2000s onwards from Sustainable Harvest. Now, Sustainable Harvest, they were set up to be a social enterprise.
Using business as a force for social good or for social change.
And Sustainable Harvest recognized that if they could elevate the skills of coffee cooperatives, this would help them be much better suppliers of organic fair trade coffees to roasters.
It's precisely to have a much more reliable supply chain.
But more importantly, it will bring much more prosperity, economic opportunity to these very remote coffee growing regions.
If now we trained a copper, a QC manager, to become better across the board and they're able to achieve better value for the product for their members, that is systemic change. That's ultimately what creates progress. That's what we set out to do in the first place.
So Sustainable Harvest recognized there is a need to level up the skills of cooperatives across Latin America.
Those capacities are not cheap. They don't happen on their own. So they need to be developed.
They already had the Let's Talk coffee gatherings, which were an opportunity for cooperatives to connect with buyers and learn what the big trends were in coffee drinking countries. And then on top of this, Sustainable Harvest developed the Most Valuable Producer Program, MVP for short.
MVP is a program that invests directly in the development of capabilities by the supply chain. So cupping calibrations, price risk management, new technologies for processing, logistics efficiencies, access to finance, productivity in the field, improved varietals, any and all of those, and multiple layers, because that's how they have the tools to stay competitive in the marketplace.
Roberto, the general manager of RAOS, he tells me that the Let's Talk coffee gatherings, the Most Valuable Producer Program, it's the best education they've received as a cooperative.
Y creo que ha sido nuestras mejores escuelas que hemos tenido.
And with the experience that they have today, they're strong.
Estamos muy fuertes.
They feel empowered to negotiate better prices.
Muy libres de poder negociar.
Which means they can pass on these benefits to their cooperative members.
Y eso nos fortalece para traer más beneficio a la organización.
A well-run cooperative like RAOS is what enabled hundreds of farmers across the region to put down the agrochemicals and convert their farms to organic. The farmers in this region had finally overcome the fourth and final hurdle. They had a successful cooperative nearby who could enable small-scale farmers to make a transition to organic in the first place. And I caught a glimpse as to where the RAOS cooperative is today. On a hot afternoon, I'm in a 4x4, which takes a turn off the main highway leading out of Marcala, and we park up into RAOS's dry mill. And in one of the office buildings adjacent to the warehouse is RAOS's Coffee Quality Assurance Lab. The day I was there, I saw the Sustainable Harvest team were visiting, and they were doing a calibration cupping. I stood in the corner of the room and watched for hours as the two quality control teams from Sustainable Harvest and at RAOS, they both together tasted the same coffees over and over and over again, inputted their flavor scores into an iPad on an app developed by Sustainable Harvest called Tasteify, and they could see to what extent they were aligned on the flavors of the same coffees. And on this particular day, Juan Angel Velches, Sustainable Harvest's former in-country liaison officer, said, yeah, we're pretty close.
The highest difference was in one coffee, one very controversial coffee, which was only 50.54.
I also got in the car and went, up into the mountains that surround Macala, where I visited RAOS's laboratory and wet mill.
¿Cómo se llama? Un medio laboratorio que tenemos acá.
The lab manager showed me how they use silver nitrate chromatography to assess the soil quality of their members.
Este es casi como una fotografía. Es como una fotografía de los 80 así.
He then opened a freezer and showed me frozen samples of different fungi, which they add to their organic compost to create a greater array of mountain microorganisms.
Son hongos, Bavarian y Metarrhizium. Son los que trabajamos para implementarle a la...
I cover why this is really important for these organic farmers in the previous episode. And then, as we walk out of the lab and walk down a dirt road, I see RAOS's recently renovated, enlarged wet mill. Ooh, okay, so we're walking down into a big shed and a big pile of... That's fresh. That's rotting. And I stare up at this enormous mound of coffee pulp, just like Don Rufino from the previous episode, with huge white streaks of mountain microorganisms running through it. These are the investments the cooperative is making in itself so it can be of better service to its members.
Igualmente a usted también. Fue un placer conocerlos. Bueno, que les vaya muy bien.
Gracias. I hop back in the car and we drive back down the winding mountain roads to the town, Marcala. As we snake our way down the mountain, I look out the window and I see beautiful, natural forests. And then I realize, no, these are actually, for the most part, organic coffee farms. They just look like natural forests because they have so many different types of shade tree. I can literally see how far this organic movement has spread across the mountains surrounding Marcala. The organic movement here has been an enormous success. I think back to all the hurdles that small group of pioneering organic farmers had to overcome. They had to learn how to farm coffee organically, commercially. They had to stomach that trough of despair when they converted their farms and their yields fell off a cliff. They had to figure out a way of getting higher prices, which they did by coming together as a cooperative and going through the rigmarole of organic certification. And then they had to compete as a supplier of coffee in a fiercely competitive global coffee market. But they managed it. And every year, when it comes to coffee farming, it seems like there is yet another hurdle. When I visited, the big challenge they were facing was actually a lack of people. After the pandemic, inflation shot up, and many households in these communities couldn't make ends meet. Many men migrated to the USA illegally to find work. And this affected the wet mill I had just visited. They were struggling to process the coffee because they couldn't find workers. The car turns a corner and I see the town of Marcala down in the distance. I see the Marcala River winding its way past the terracotta roofs. The river looks like a healthy river. It's not like it was 30 years ago, black, with dead fish bobbing along being carried downstream. I'm sure this community will find a way to overcome the lack of labor as well. Because it was the will of the same group of people that managed to convert many people in this community to organic farming, who changed the landscapes of these hillsides, and even managed to change the color of the river. Doing this story changed my understanding of organic farming. I finally understood why it's so important to soil, to ecosystems, to farmers and why they choose to do it in the first place. And I decide I'm going to support this going forward. And I do this by choosing to buy specialty organic coffee whenever I can. So, thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, it would mean so much to me if you could tell your friends about it. Word of mouth is like the way in which the word spreads about podcasts. I don't have a marketing budget, it's just me. I really rely on people like you loving what I create and wanting to share it with, your friends. And one great way you could do that is on Instagram. Take a screen grab of your podcast player listening to this episode, share it as a story on Instagram, tag me at Filter Stories Podcast, and I can say thank you and repost it at the same time. Now, over on Instagram, I have lots of photos from my trip to RAOS. You can see for yourself their wet mill, the soil chromatography samples, the cupping at the dry mill, and lots of really, really beautiful photos of Marcala. I love this region of Honduras, it's so beautiful. If you work in the coffee industry, you will have heard the news that Sustainable Harvest early in 2023 was acquired by Sucofina, a much larger green bean supplier. I began working with Sustainable Harvest before the Sucofina acquisition, which actually took place after I had already left Honduras. So what I saw in Honduras was what Sustainable Harvest was doing before Sucofina. And when I was on the phone with Jorge Cuevas, Sustainable Harvest Chief Coffee Officer, I asked him, what is the future of Sustainable Harvest? And here's what he told me.
So here's the fun part about the acquisition of Sucofina of Sustainable Harvest. We recognized at Sustainable Harvest that we needed more resources to continue to do what we had been doing. There was increased market volatility. The interest rate environment was shifting. Logistics was shifting. So a mid-sized company like Sustainable Harvest was starting to feel like, hey, I'm vulnerable, which by the way was a vulnerability that we had never felt before. But sure enough, you just needed to have a stronger foundation to withstand the market environment. So the beauty about the Sucofina acquisition is that they came and said, hey, in about 5 to 7 years, we wanted to improve our sustainability credentials and we wanted to move in the direction of what Sustainable Harvest is going. By acquiring you guys and working together, we're going to get there in 2. Basically, Sucofina was already well on its way and we just helped them accelerate where they wanted to go. Sustainable Harvest remains independent. It operates independent. We have our own managing director. We remain a B Corp, certified B Corp. Basically, what we get to continue to do what we have done so far, but just with more resources available to us.
Now let me tell you what else is coming in this series of The Science of Coffee. In the next episode, I'm going to show you a personal journey that I went on, where I finally understood what robust scientific methodology looks like and why it's so important when it comes to coffee. Now, the journey I went on was made possible by BWT, Water and More. They make water filtration kits for the home, in the cafe, and wrapping my head around the science of water is what helped me transform from a good-intentioned, if somewhat naive coffee professional to a leveled up home scientist. In the final episodes of this series, I show you how you can get the best flavors from your coffee beans by taking you into the science of coffee aging and coffee grinding. I spend a couple of days with the technical wizards at Malkönig, an industry leader in coffee grinders, trusted by baristas globally. I discover how their grinders actually work and why it is that tiny changes can lead to dramatically different coffees. And now, in case you missed it, in the first episodes of this series, I help you become a better coffee taster by unraveling the science of our taste and smell. I also get a little bit metaphysical. I brew up many of the exact same coffee with Marco Beverage Systems SP9 brewer, This brewer is designed to make very consistent batches of coffee. And then I give the exact same coffee to many different people. And when I ask them what it tastes like, I get wildly different responses. Are we living in the same flavor reality? And actually, that episode was so hard to make, I wrote a little story about the torturous process I went through to create it. If you're interested in checking it out, sign up to my Substack newsletter. Link in the show notes. And then in the episodes just before this one, I explore the science of roasting. The place where so many of coffee's flavors are created. And I go to visit Roost, a Norwegian company that is developing a fully automatic coffee roaster. With their team, I open up their prototype roaster, the P3000, see the cutting edge technology in it, and I finally understand why it takes so much technology to roast coffee automatically and extremely consistently. The Science of Coffee is produced by me, James Harper. I also write and play the piano music. And I want to give extra special thanks to everyone who lent me their time in Marcala. The wonderful team at Sustainable Harvest, everybody over at RAOS, Osman Contreras, Elvin Jesus Ruiz, Perfecto Dominguez, and Roger Danilo Moreno. Thanks again for listening, and I'll speak to you next time.